Hello viewers, welcome back to NPTEL's Basic Ornithology course. In this session, we will explore diversity of birds and how birds are classified on the basis of taxonomic principles. In the past, taxonomy used to be a science of classification based on studying museum specimens. But with the arrival of genetic tools and techniques, molecular taxonomy has taken the root over the last 3 to 4 decades. And today, the word systematics is preferred to taxonomy as a reflection of this progress and expansion of the scope of the science of taxonomy. The protein and DNA signatures have tremendously changed the world view of how birds are related to each other. Interestingly, we find that morphological similarities are often superficial. For example, we now realize that falcons are not true raptors, but instead they are more closely related to parakeets. And even at a lower level, species limits often pose a great challenge, and with the molecular tools, species limits are being increasingly resolved. For example, our erstwhile purple swampin, a very common water bird, is now thought to comprise 6 species globally. This is an outcome of how we define a species based on genetic similarities. And this is precisely what we will learn in this video. We will first get ourselves familiar with some fundamental principles of avian taxonomy, species concepts, and different schools of thought. Then we will move on to modern classification of birds with reference to Indian avifauna. So, why should we care about bird taxonomy? So, taxonomy has been traditionally viewed as an esoteric discipline left to taxonomists to discuss and resolve issues in classification. So, it is natural to ask this question. So, what does a bird ecologist or conservationist or a bird watcher benefit from knowledge of taxonomy? Well, there are over 10,000 species of birds in the world, of which 1,300 species are found in India. This amazing diversity naturally raises several questions. How are these species related to each other, and when and where did they speciate? So, knowledge of taxonomy and classification is critical to understanding these questions of evolutionary relationships. And a knowledge of family and genus level relationships is also very important in interpreting the findings of ecological studies on birds. For example, are phylogenetically similar or closer species also ecologically similar? What plays a major role in structure of avian assemblages, evolutionary history or ecology, and so on. Interestingly, a good understanding of bird classification greatly helps us in developing species identification skill in the field. This is because bird species belonging to a particular genus or family or even order often share similar morphological, vocal and behavioral traits. So, a basic knowledge of a family, genus or order to which a species belongs will also help us to identify that particular species or the group to which that species belongs right in the field. So, that actually makes you a much better and informed bird watcher. And finally, one of the critical applications of taxonomic knowledge is in identifying threatened populations of bird taxa. As you know, threat status of a species is generally assessed across its global distribution range. So, this is based on an assumption that all the populations in the range belong to one single species. But what if some isolated and distinct populations turn out to be different species and may need immediate conservation intervention because they are low in number or because they face some ecological threats in their local level? We will see next a real world example. Grey teal is a small resident duck found in all types of wetlands, mostly brackish water, and distributed through Oriental and Australasian regions. Till 2012, it was considered as a single species with 3 subspecies, as you can see from these maps. So, Albogularis in Andamans, Gyparifrons in Southeast Asia and Gracilis in Australasian region. Since the range was pretty large, its population size was considered good enough to be classified as least concern in IUCN assessment. In other words, the population was considered as safe. But in the year 2013, the species was split into 3 distinct species based on reassessments of the species limits, mostly based on morphology. So, this resulted in the Indian population becoming Andaman teal, endemic to the Andaman Islands, and a reassessment of their conservation status lead to Andaman teal designated as vulnerable and the Indonesian Sunda teal as near threatened. So, this shows how change in species limits could result in cascading effect on our conservation assessment. A species that was once considered as safe across its global range is now considered actually comprise 2 populations, which one of them which is vulnerable and another is near threatened. So, let us now see a brief history of bird taxonomy. So, in the past, taxonomy used to be solely based on similarities and dissimilarities in morphological and anatomical characters in birds, an approach commonly called as comparative anatomy. So, it was the German ornithologist Hans Gadow who first proposed in late 19th century 40 taxonomic characters for bird classification. In fact, these 40 anatomical characters still remain the gold standard in avian systematics, largely corroborated by even molecular evidences today. So, they mainly include a typology based on palate type, pelvic musculature, deep plantar dentons and so on. So, for a very long time, comparative anatomy ruled the field of taxonomy, but it was Charles G. Sibley, the American ornithologist from Yale University, who first applied the electrophoresis of egg white proteins in 1960s as a molecular technique to ascertain evolutionary relationships between taxa and to infer taxonomic relationships. Shortly afterwards, Sibley began applying DNA-DNA hybridization technique to compute genetic similarity between a given pair of bird taxa. So, you can actually refer to key references that will be provided as supplementary readings to know more about the DNA-DNA hybridization technique. So, following the next 2 to 3 decades of intensive sampling and molecular analysis, Sibley along with his colleague Alquist developed the first modern classification of birds. So, DNA-DNA hybridization very soon gave way to gene sequencing as genetic tools and techniques became more accurate and affordable. Today, molecular taxonomy has become an established field covering various taxa from plants to mammals, and birds pave the way for other taxa as well. So, but that's the, of late you see a plethora of gene sequencing papers in molecular taxonomy being published every now and then in different journals. But systematists also caution that results of these molecular evidences or techniques are not as robust as they are often made out to be. There are still several gaps and gray areas in analysis of gene sequencing data that remain unresolved or at best contentious. Therefore, biologists now strongly pitch for an integrated taxonomy, wherein reliable evidences from multiple approaches are gathered to build a strong case. These approaches include like morphology, anatomy, genetics, behavior, ecology or phylogeography. And that's increasingly being applied in bird taxonomy. So, how birds are grouped in a classification tree? So, let us see a simplistic explanation of how organisms are grouped in the hierarchy of taxonomy using birds. Among the vertebrates, that is the organisms with the backbone, the topmost group is called class. So, there are 5 classes representing fishes, amphibians, reptiles, birds and mammals. Of course, our interest here is the class Aves that represent birds in Latin. So, remember all taxonomic names are traditionally written in Latin or Greek, that is derived from Latin. So, among the class Aves, there are diverse groups of birds sharing common ancestry, therefore showing some similarities within each group. So, these groups are called orders. So, for example, we see some orders displayed here from Galliforms that include all game birds and fowl-like birds, Columbiforms with pigeons and doves, Charadriiforms with waders or shorebirds, Strigiforms with all the owls, and Passeriforms with all the songbirds or passerines. And note that the names of the order always end in the suffix -formis. So, that is the taxonomic tradition, and all the birds of the world have been grouped under 44 orders. Well, some authorities treat it under more than 46 orders. So, now let us see just one order among these things, Passeriforms, that is the songbirds or the perching birds or passerines, the largest group among the birds. So, when we look into the Passeriforms, there are again similar groups of taxa are arranged within Passeriforms. So, they are called as families. Like for example, here some representative families have been given of the like pittas from Pittidae, larks from family Allardidae, crows of family Corvidae and so on. So, note that the suffix here of family ends with -idae. So, now we will choose one family of Corvidae, that is the family of crows. And when we go deeper into the family of Corvidae, we find again the family has several genera, or in singular form is genus. So, that is the next level of similarity among the members of the family Corvidae. So, the Corvidae family Corvidae has crows belonging to the genus Corvus, jays belonging to the genus Garrulus, and treepies belonging to Dendrocita, and choughs of the alpine mountain areas under the genus Pyrrhocorax, and so on. So, we will now see, we will just select one genus, that is Corvus, that is the typical crows. So, the next level of taxa below the genus is the actual species, the last unit of taxonomic classification. So, two species of crows are shown here in the genus Corvus, large-billed crow and house crow. Actually, there are 45 species in this genera around the world. In India, we have probably 7 to 8 species of crows in the Indian subcontinent. So, you can see that a species is written as a combination of both genus and species names. So, this practice is called binomial nomenclature in taxonomy. This scientific name of a species, like for example, Corvus macrorhynchos for large-billed crow, this is to ensure unambiguous communication over the idea of a taxon across languages or region. So, the house crow is known as Corvus splendens. So, as per the International Code for Zoological Nomenclature, the most basic unit of any taxonomic hierarchy is the species, and no further groupings are recognized. But however, in some taxa, including birds, species are often grouped into subspecies or race based on geographic differences in morphology. For example, house crow comprise 4 subspecies as shown here, each occurring in different parts of its distribution range, like Corvus splendens in mainland India, Corvus splendens zagmayeri in the northwest India, Proticatus in southern India and Sri Lanka. So, you can notice subtle morphological differences among these taxa. So, they are called subspecies in the sense that they are still belong to the same species, that's the house crow. So if you now wonder why some levels of similarity give rise to families and others genera, the answer lies in the degree of evolutionary relationship among the taxa. So this degree of evolutionary relationship determines whether this relationship has to be termed or grouped under order or family or genus. So taxonomists have accordingly developed several criteria in this regard, of course, which are still debatable and also vary between authorities. So we will now see some of the basic concepts in taxonomy. One such key criterion of evolution, assessing evolution relationship, is whether the observed similarities between two taxa are true or not. So biologists call the true similarity as homology and the false similarity as homoplasy. So homology refers to true similarity in a trait between two taxa, as the similarities arise out of common ancestry. So they are true because they have same evolutionary origin. Homologous characters are the most useful in taxonomic classification, and they are further divided into simpliciomorphic and synapomorphic, whether they are shared primitive or whether they are shared derived. And of course, the shared derived homologous characters, that is synapomorphic characters. So they are the ones which biologists are actually looking for while classifying and grouping the species. In contrast, homoplasy refers to false similarity in a trait between two taxa. These similarities are considered false because they do not have common ancestry. So they perhaps evolved independently in response to some ecological requirements or as adaptations in a process called convergence. Since homoplasy infers false similarity, such characters are not useful in taxonomy. So in fact, interestingly, the traditional taxonomy, which is largely based on morphological comparative morphology, so often fails to detect this such convergence. And so in fact, we are increasingly detecting convergence or false similarity using molecular tools. We will see one example. Let us see this example. This is the two pictures of nectar feeding birds with a long bill as an adaptation to feed on nectars of flowers. One is the bee hummingbird of the New World, second is the purple sunbird in the Old World. So they look very similar, very colorful, iridescent colors and a very long and bill to enable to extract the nectar. There is another pair. One is the first is the Toco toucan and the great pied hornbill. Toucans are from the Central and Southern America, where the hornbills are from Oriental region. Now these are the classical examples of what we call as homoplasy, because they are completely unrelated to each other. For example, bee hummingbird, actually they are more related to swifts, and sunbirds are actually passerines with common ancestors with actually in fact they are on the extremes of the classification tree. And toucans and hornbills, though they are not as distant as hummingbirds and sunbird, but nonetheless they are still not directly related to each other. They are probably separated by more than 2 or 3 ancestors. So the adaptation, the bill color and bill structure probably evolved independently in response to some local ecological requirements. But if you see the little spider hunter, which is again a oriental species, this also has a long bill which enables to feed on nectars. So, but that is what we call as homology, because little spider hunter and purple sunbird, they belong to the same family and probably they have the same ancestor from which they derive this long bill, which is adapted to feeding on nectar. So it is a true taxonomic character. That is what we call as homology. Now we will go on to clade, cladogram and taxa, the terms which you often come across while assessing taxonomy, while studying taxonomy of birds. We will This tree, and you can see the tree and branches diagram. This is conventionally used to describe the relationships, the evolutionary relationships among birds. The red circles at the end of the branches refer to taxa. It could be genus, family, or species. And the nodes from where they diverge or branch off, so they refer to common ancestors from which the taxa diverge with respect to, of course, synapomorphic characters, that is the shared derived characters that we see in the earlier slide. So let us assume these tree covers water birds from ducks to waders and storks. The first group is called anseriforms with ducks, and the next one is the syconiforms comprising of the storks of the old world. Now the third group is the order Charadriiformes. So that consists of the waders and shorebirds. Now the highlighted region all grouped under one order Charadriiformes. So now this highlighted taxa constitute one evolutionary group, right? So this is called a clade. So, and this tree diagram is called a cladogram because it shows how different clades are arranged on an evolutionary tree. A clade can be any group within these with a common node. So in fact, even the order Charadriiformes is one clade, even order Syconiformes is another clade, order Anseriformes is another clade. And also this particular order Charadriiformes can have multiple subclades which themselves form separate clades like families, like family Recurvirosteridae or Charadriidae of flowers or Jaganidae of jaganas. So each family again forms a clade within the larger clade of Charadriiformes. Note that this cladogram is much simplified one to demonstrate its concept. In real analysis, you may need to develop cladograms equally across the clades, because for here actually we have treated Charadriiformes much more in detail than compared to the Anseriformes or Syconiformes. So this is the basic concept of the cladogram and what's called a clade. And in fact, the entire thing belongs to the infraclass Neognathae. It can also be called a clade. The next one is that concept is the monophyly. So a clade, theoretically speaking, should be monophyletic, in the sense that, in other words, a clade should comprise all its descendants and their ancestor. This phenomenon is termed monophyly in systematics. By this definition, each order, family, or even genus should be monophyletic in theory, but mostly they are not. In fact, that's the purpose of the whole molecular studies, molecular taxonomy studies. We will see one example. So in this example cladogram, it's a very simple cladogram. The green circle C, D, E share the same ancestor 3. So the ancestor 3, that the monophyletic clade 3 is the clade 3 is actually monophyletic because it has all the descendant species C, D, E and the ancestor together. So it's called a monophyletic clade. And one example is the family Phasianidae of game birds or the fowl-like birds. As per the current knowledge, this family has all the known members, and we do not suspect any member that has been placed in other bird families. So we consider family Phasianidae of game birds as a monophyletic family. Fine. So now we will see the other types, the paraphyly. Suppose if any member is left out of a clade, it is termed as paraphyly. See this example. In this example, the taxon A is left out of the supposed clade 3, making the clade 3 as paraphyletic, because the taxon A has been placed in some other clade, that is clade number 1 instead of clade number 3. So, the clade number 3 now becomes paraphyletic, it is no longer monophyly. Of course, taxonomists assume each designated order, family or genus as monophyletic until someone discovers the phenomenon of paraphyly and undertakes the course correction. For example, this is the family Paridae of tits, a group of tiny insectivorous birds of forest canopy, and the family Paridae was long thought to be monophyletic because they all look very similar behaviorally, vocally and ecologically, and there is no reason to suspect any other bird as belonging to this one. There is also the second family Corvidae, so crows and allies. So, including the high altitude ground, that Corvidae has one species, the high altitude Hume's ground pecker it is called. So, for a very long time it was considered as a corvid, very closely related to crows because it behaves more like choughs, which is also in the crow family. So, everything was fine till Helen James and her colleagues in 2003 discovered through molecular studies that Hume's ground pecker was actually a tit. So, it was an accidental discovery through the molecular studies in the phylogeny. Suddenly, both the families now become paraphyletic because Corvidae has one member which does not actually belong to them. Paridae did not have that member which actually a parid, which was put in Corvidae. So, Hume's ground pecker was subsequently moved to Paridae and renamed as ground tit, in line with other tits in the family. So, now after moving these things, after moving of Hume's ground pecker to Paridae, both the families now become monophyletic. Now, this is the purpose of the taxonomists. They always strive for making all the order, families, genus as monophyletic as possible, because that's what that's what makes our arrangement of evolutionary relationships correct, more accurate. So, if you look at the polyphyly, there is other extreme form of non-monophyly in which taxa that are separated by more than two ancestors are placed together in a group. In earlier paraphyly, we saw taxon being separated by more than one ancestor, but the polyphyly is that by more than two ancestors. So, let us see this example. This one clade, clade 1. So, here the clade 1, it probably, this example, the taxa A, B, C, D, E, all of them have been grouped together under the clade, but someone discovers that taxon B and D do not belong to this clade and they probably belong to completely two different clades. So, that scenario, this clade will become polyphyletic because it contains two species or two taxa which actually belong to two other clades. One classic example is the group of wren babblers. So, Indian subcontinent has 14 species of these wren babblers, a group of very tiny insectivorous birds of the dense undergrowth in the wet evergreen forests of the Himalaya. They are very extremely shy birds, but can easily be detected through their song and calls, which are very distinct. They are brown in color with very short to almost non-existent tails. So, morphologically they look confusingly similar. For a long time, all the wren babblers were placed in the typical babbler family of Timalidae, and no one suspected their identity to be of any different. But a series of molecular studies combined with analysis of vocalizations revealed that wren babblers as a group are polyphyletic. So, they actually belong to three different families, and in fact one species, that is spotted wren babbler, in fact that was found to be a unique taxon that belonging with we actually warranting erection of new family, that is called Elachuridae. So, it was the family this is the spotted wren babbler. So now spotted wren babbler is such a unique taxa that it is now found to be closely related to waxwings and kinglets rather than babblers. So this is called polyphyly, and this has been quite common because our traditional taxonomy is always based on morphological characters which fail to detect convergence in morphology. We will now explore a more fundamental question in biology that has immense ramifications for taxonomy as well. What exactly is a species, the fundamental unit of biodiversity and classification? For example, two species of miniverts and insectivorous groups of woodland birds are shown here, scarlet minivert and orange minivert, along with their distribution ranges taken from eBird. So while scarlet minivert is spread across central and northern India, orange minivert is confined to southwestern India and Sri Lanka. So till some years ago, both were treated as subspecies of a single species, the larger scarlet minivert. But differences in morphology, vocalization and allopatric distributions, that means they have been distributed in two distinct populations, led to their split. So what are the criteria that define a species? Well, the answer varies with different species concepts. The most popular and long held view was the biological species concept, shortly known as BSC, sometimes referred also to as evolutionary species concept. So it was formalized by Ernst Mayr in 1942. As per this definition, a species refers to a group of interbreeding natural populations that are reproductively isolated from each other or from other such groups. One of the weaknesses of BSC is that it cannot be applied to asexually reproducing taxa or even to sexually reproducing taxa like birds that are geographically distinct, like the case of the miniverts shown here. So when two populations are geographically isolated, how do we ascertain if they would mate? Like the case of these two miniverts shown here, perhaps they were treated as a single species earlier on the assumption that they would mate if they were together. But that's quite speculative. To circumvent this issue, phylogenetic species concept was proposed by Joel Gracroft in 1982. So PSC, sometimes called as cladistic species concept, emphasizes on two components of a species: diagnosability and common descent. As such, phylogenetic species concept does not recognize subspecies, as any diagnosably distinct subspecies would merit a species status. Though PSC is progressive and accommodative of all forms of taxa, including asexually reproducing organisms, evolutionary history of most of the species still remains unknown. So that's the issue with the applying phylogenetic species concept across board. Considering these, a hybrid approach is increasingly used in systematics. Like biological species concept remains the mainstay of species limits, but in case of allopatric, that means geographically disjunct and diagnosably distinct populations, phylogenetic species concept is applied, like the case of these two miniverts. Besides the very philosophical issue of defining a species, there are also other challenges from the real world organisms, and birds are no exception. One such challenge is the polymorphism, where a species occurs in different plumage or color morphs, and these morphs often live together, they readily mate with each other, and the color morphs seem to be heritable in most cases, if not all. All these attributes defy a conventional definition of species. Genetic models show that polymorphism may arise out of disruptive selection, a selection driven by particular environmental factors. But we have just begun to explore the biology of polymorphism, as it is not yet fully understood. Polymorphism is particularly common in taxa, bird taxa like raptors, seabirds, cuckoos, and game birds. One of the classical examples among the Indian avifauna pertains to variable wheatear, a species of insectivorous birds in northwestern India of semi-arid tracts. So, variable wheatear occurs in three morphs. As you can see from these three distinct pictures, they look like completely three different species, but then the females look very much alike, and often they interbreed and they occur together. So, for a very long time, all the three morphs, Capistrata, Piccata, or Opistholeuca, all the three forms have always been treated sometimes as subspecies, sometimes even as separate species. And also take the case of raptors like booted eagle. So, most of these raptors have very distinct dark morph and very distinct pale morph. And in fact, it is now increasingly known that even sometimes, the same individuals some seasons may adopt, the pale morph plumage, and some species the dark morph as well. So, this poses a great challenge to species identification or even definition of a species. Another challenge in species designation in birds stems from what we call as cryptic species. Cryptic species refers to two or more species that look morphologically similar yet do not interbreed. Often they were long thought to be single species, till someone discovers them to be a complex involving two or more species. For these reasons, they are also known as sibling species. Cryptic species are very common in birds that are normally challenging for bird watchers to identify. These include gulls, larks, pipits, prionias, and warblers. This example shown here is that of the golden spectacled warbler of the Himalayas. Long believed to be a single species, Per Ahlström, the Swedish ornithologist and taxonomist, in 1999 discovered through extensive analysis of vocalizations that this single species of golden spectacled warbler actually comprised of no less than 6 species. And the other issue is the hybrids, which cause problems in identifying species ID. Contrary to our perception, birds do hybridize in the wild, and quite often. Hybridization between two closely related species often results in hybrids with plumage patterns distinct from the parent taxa. So, normally hybrids do not survive beyond F2 generation, but when they do perpetuate to small localized populations on some rare occasions, they are often mistaken as new species. A classic example among the Indian avifauna is the case of the intermediate parakeet, also known as Rothschild's parakeet. It was never seen in the wild, but was known only from a handful of live specimens in captivity from sub-Himalayan Gangetic plains of UP and Bihar. It remained a mystery bird for very long. So, it was American ornithologist Pamela C. Rasmussen who demonstrated that intermediate parakeet was actually a hybrid between plum-headed parakeet and slaty-headed parakeets, and most likely in captivity. Other intriguing problem of species concepts in ornithology is what is commonly termed as ring species. It's a very peculiar phenomenon. So, ring species refers to a species complex around a geographic ring. Neighboring populations along this ring freely interbreed, but those at the end of the ring do not and behave as if they belong to the different species. Though the phenomenon of ring species has been reported from several bird taxa, it has been very hotly debated among the biogeographers. Some of the common examples from birds include herring gulls around the Arctic ring and great tits and greenish warbler around the Tibetan plateau ring. So this example shows the ring distribution of greenish warbler complex around the Tibetan plateau, from Viridanus in the west to Trochilidus in the south. So 4 interbreeding taxa are involved as a ring shaped distribution. So, but the Plumbitorsus, which is in the eastern Asia, when they meet Trochilidus, they behave as if they do belong to 2 distinct species. They don't recognize each other. So the erstwhile single species of greenish warbler is now treated as a complex of 3 species, including Nitidus, which branched off from Viridanus, and Plumbitorsus. So these are some of the major issues of species definition in birds and ornithology. When we will just see a brief of what are the major systems of bird classification that exist in the past and today. So several classification schemes were proposed for birds all along the course of the history of ornithology. However, 2 classifications rule the world of ornithology through most part of 20th century. The first was developed by Alexander Wetmore, an American ornithologist, in 1930s. Wetmore's classification put finches as the last terminal taxa among the birds, widely followed in the old world, including India. So if you look at the Salim Ali and Ripley's classic handbook, they actually followed Alexander Wetmore's classification. The second major classification was that of the British ornithologist James L. Peters, proposed first in 1931. So Peters' list had crows as the last taxa, contrary to Wetmore's, but otherwise it was quite similar to what Wetmore has proposed. Curiously, Peters' classification was more popular in the New World, though it originated from the Europe. Moroni et al. Then published an updated classification of birds in 1975, taking into consideration all the published works on avian taxonomy and species limits in the second half of the 20th century. This was followed by the iconic series Handbook of the Birds of the World, a 17-volume reference book. Then arrived the Sibley and Munro's first modern system of classification of birds in 1990, based on molecular data using DNA hybridization. As I noted earlier, this was truly a turning point in the history of systematic ornithology, as it laid the basis for birds the molecular taxonomy. Several new proposals of avian relationships and taxonomic position proposed by Sibley, Ahlqvist and Munro have been subsequently corroborated by more intensive genetic analysis. These include recognition of Australian origin and radiation of crows, separation of button quail from cranes and rails, recognition of New World vultures as evolutionarily distinct from Old World vultures, and identification of paradise flycatchers as closely related to crows rather than flycatchers. Post Sibley, numerous phylogenetic studies have been conducted on a wide range of taxa, bird taxa, using gene sequencing and other molecular techniques. So these studies have tremendously contributed to our current understanding of species limits and higher order taxonomy. Riding on the wave of these new findings, 4 major systems of bird classification have emerged in recent times. Among these, Howard and Moore's 4th edition by Edward Dickinson is the most scholarly work. However, Howard and Moore's 4th edition became static with no further annual updates. Then next major system of classification is the IOC, International Ornithological Council's World Bird List. This is maintained by a panel of leading systematists and gets regularly updated. In fact, it is recently been adopted by British Ornithologists Union. So, the next major list is by BirdLife International, which is perhaps the most controversial among these, because it is based on Dobias et al., who published a new methodology of scoring of similarities in morphology and vocalization to assess species limits. And since they did not consider genetic molecular evidences, it was quite controversial. It was not really very well accepted by most other taxonomists. But nonetheless, since BirdLife International undertakes the red list assessment of birds for IUCN, this taxonomy is also followed by IUCN by default. And the fourth one originates from America, as it is based on annual updates of the American Ornithologists Union, the Clements list. And it is perhaps the most popular classification today, as it is also the base for eBird platform, used by millions of birdwatchers around the world. Back in India, Praveen et al., who maintained the India Birds checklist of the Indian Birds Journal, began with Howard and Moore, 4th edition classification, but since there was no further annual updates to Howard and Moore, they later adopted a consensus model of taxonomic authorities, particularly the IOC and the Clements and eBird classifications. So, and yes, existence of the fourth system, major systems of the classification, does pose lots of issues, particularly in conservation circles and also communication among birdwatchers and ornithologists. So, which one to follow? So, every country has ornithological organizations who choose to follow one among these things. So, now there are attempts to forge consensus among them, so that a single uniform system of bird classification and nomenclature can evolve. But hope it will happen soon. And so, even the last IOC Congress, these attempts were made, but it didn't meet much success. So, by the way, but why do these bird lists differ? For example, in India, we have several standard bird lists, right from Alien Ripley's handbook and Grimmett and Inskip's, and also Chris Kazmierczyk's field guides, then Birds of South Asia Ripley guide by Rasmussen, and also the Praveen et al.'s Indian Birds checklist. So, they essentially differ in terms of two basic principles. First is that which school of taxonomy do they follow, whether it is the evolutionary school or phonetic school or the modern phylogenetic or cladistic school. So, they may not explicitly acknowledge such allegiance, you can see traces to that effect. For example, Rasmussen's Ripley guide and Praveen et al. India checklist both favor phylogenetic or cladistic evidences. The second principle pertains to the species concept that they adopt. Most do follow the more traditional evolutionary species concept or the biological species concept. However, Ripley guide and Indian Birds checklist seem to embrace phylogenetic species concept for some select problematic taxa, particularly where the taxa are geographically distinct and morphologically dissimilar. Thank you.